In recent years, the Elliott School has invited an exceptionally accomplished member of the international affairs community to speak on this auspicious occasion. This year, we are privileged to have with us former Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration, the Honorable Anne C. Richard. Ms. Richard began her career in 1984 as a presidential management intern and was then assigned to the U.S. Office of Management and Budget. After living in West Germany, remember West Germany? After living in West Germany for a time as a fellow of the Robert Bosch Foundation, she returned to the U.S. and joined the State Department, where she served in a variety of roles, including helping to create the International Crisis Group, serving as an advisor in the Deputy Secretary of State's Office of Policy and Resources, and then later serving as the director of that office. Additionally, Ms. Richard has served as the Chief Advisor for Budget and Planning for former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, as Deputy Chief Financial Officer of the Peace Corps, and as Vice President of Governmental Relations and Advocacy at the International Rescue Committee, before being nominated by President Obama to be Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. Throughout her career, she has maintained a focus on making this country, and indeed the world, a better, safer place. As a former colleague and a good friend, I'm looking forward to hearing her reflections and advice for our graduates, and I also cannot think of anyone better to give you a charge as you go off into the world. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to welcome to the Elliott School's 2017 graduation celebration its commencement speaker, the Honorable Anne C. Richard.
Thank you very much, Dean Brigady, otherwise known as Reuben. Greetings to everyone. Russell, you're a hard act to follow, but I will persevere. And congratulations to the graduates. I want you to indulge me just for a moment. I want you to all take your right hand and hold your hand up very, very high. And then bend your elbow here, and now pat yourselves on the back. Very well done. Now that you've done that, we're going to pivot. Instead of spending the rest of these remarks telling you how wonderful and accomplished you are, I now want to devote some time to encouraging you to do even more. You graduates have chosen a most extraordinary time to earn your degrees and set out into the world. I suppose graduation speakers have always said this, but in 2017, it is a bit of an understatement. At the outset, let me acknowledge the diverse student group graduating today. You come from across the United States and from more than 24 countries, including China, India, Germany, Brazil, and South Korea. Among the Americans here today, among the graduates and their guests, let's assume we have present among us Hillary Clinton voters, Donald Trump voters, disenchanted voters, and non-voters. In my remarks today, I do want to talk about the American political scene, but I don't want to just talk about our new president. Let's turn our attention for a moment away from the drama at the White House and focus instead on the times in which we live. When Dean Brigady asked me to speak today, he mentioned the importance of the current historic moment and the work I have done, and he and I at times have done together with other colleagues in and out of government to help the record numbers of refugees and other victims of conflict around the world. Those of us who have worked on humanitarian policies and programs know that there are too many crises occurring at the same time. They are lasting too long and too few are being resolved. We are sowing the seeds for misery for years to come if we allow children to be malnourished and stunted, or young people to be left uneducated and unskilled, and conflicts to go on and on and on. The United States has a history of leading in providing humanitarian assistance around the world and championing human rights. At this point, I should acknowledge the work I've seen done by a couple of George Washington students over the past couple of years. Matthew Donovan and Maria Hershey and friends have created and led the No Lost Generation Club here at George Washington, an initiative to help Syrian refugees. They've been so successful that there are now 50 similar clubs in other campuses across the United States and overseas. Join me in congratulating them. The history of Americans helping, however, is now in doubt as U.S. policies undergo changes. Alliances are being questioned, budgets are being proposed for deep cuts, and a reorganization of the State Department is expected. Meanwhile, there are some 65 million displaced people around the world, more than 40 million uprooted but still inside the borders of their home countries, and more than 20 million who have fled across international borders and thus are considered refugees. In the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, countries are hosting hundreds of thousands of refugees. In the Western Hemisphere, displaced Colombians pray that a new era of peace can begin. At the same time, young people and families flee violence in the Northern Triangle of Central America and decide to undertake a dangerous trek through Mexico to reach the US border. In Europe, walls have gone up to stop the waves of migrants and refugees, including many refugees from Syria. Related to this, one of the first acts of the new Trump administration here in Washington was to issue an executive order that has become known as the travel ban. It tried to do a number of things, including pausing or suspending the program to resettle refugees in the United States, barring refugees and other travelers from 7 Muslim-majority countries, and cutting the number of refugees we bring to the United States annually from 85,000 to 50,000. It also was following through on a campaign promise, and it appeases Trump voters without worrying about its impact on the travelers, who are, of course, not American voters. And some of the travelers, the refugee families, are among the most vulnerable, most traumatized people on earth. The stated rationale was that this executive order would enhance US national security. Now, there is absolutely no evidence that this is the case. Many former officials, foreign policy and national security experts of both parties have gone on record to say that this is not the case, and refugees invited to the United States are the most heavily vetted of any traveler to our shores. So the courts have stopped implementation of the executive order. The reality is that the executive order was an expression of anti-Muslim sentiment that, while not always overtly acknowledged, is certainly driving the president's actions. It not only won't do anything positive, to prevent terrorism in this country, it exacerbates an uneasiness among some Americans who don't know any Muslims, but from hearing about or seeing photos of war and conflict and atrocities and terrorist attacks abroad, have become convinced that the word Muslim equals terrorist. If allowed into the United States, the thinking goes, Muslims will take over our country and impose Sharia law. This, of course, is not true. You graduates will know that Islam is one of the world's great religions, and 23% of the world's population is Muslim. In my travels, I have met and admired Muslim aid workers and leaders of relief operations in nearly every corner of the globe. Innocent Muslim families are victims and survivors of terrorism. Muslim neighbors take them in, and they are helped by Muslim charities, Muslim doctors and nurses, and teachers and mayors. Muslim refugees range from Syrian and Iraqi refugees fleeing war, to Rohingya Muslims fleeing persecution in Myanmar, to Somali refugee girls going to school in the slums of Kenya. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, President George W. Bush acknowledged the respect we ought to have for Islam. It's practiced freely by many millions of Americans and by millions more in countries that America counts as friends, he said. Its teachings are good and peaceful, and those who commit evil in the name of Allah blaspheme the name of Allah. Indeed, the 3 to 5 million Americans who are Muslim want nothing to do with the murder and mayhem wrought by terrorists. So what is really at work here has very little to do with national security safeguards and more to do with our tradition of being afraid of admitting the latest group of strangers. In earlier times, that's true. In earlier times, Irish immigrants were discriminated against, and then Southern Europeans. The Chinese Exclusion Act suspended immigration from China for 6 decades. Japanese Americans were under suspicion and interned during World War II. Jewish refugees were turned away during World War II, and those from Eastern Europe and Russia were mistrusted during the Cold War, suspected of being Soviet spies. Majorities of Americans were concerned by Hungarian refugees fleeing in the 1950s, Southeast Asian refugees in the 1970s, and Cubans in 1980. So, should we be surprised when, after terrorist attacks in Paris in November 2015, attacks that were largely planned and carried out by people born in Europe, pollsters discovered that a majority of Americans were against accepting refugees from Syria? 53% of Americans didn't want to accept any Syrian refugees at all. Another 11% would accept only Christian refugees from Syria. At this point, let me say that these immigration and refugee issues I study and work on and care about, along with many of the students here, give us only one example of a public policy issue where elected officials in Washington are working actively using so-called alternative facts to undermine the well-being of our families, our communities, and our traditions of caring for the poor and weak. Climate, healthcare, tax policy, questions of equity in society, whether women can be paid as much as men, whether young black men can get fair treatment from and survive an encounter with the police. Whether economy class customers on airplanes deserve to be treated decently. These are debates about the extent to which we can choose for ourselves how we live our lives and who we love, and even how much privacy we can enjoy and how much dignity we are accorded. All of these issues of our day, all of these discussions touch on or are rooted in our values. Secretary of State Tillerson gave a speech to State Department employees at a town hall meeting recently in which he suggested that U.S. diplomats would be informed by our values, but would pursue America First policies to strengthen our economy and national security. If we condition too heavily that others must adopt this value that we've come to over a long history of our own, he said, it really creates obstacles to our ability to advance our national security interests or economic interests. Not long after, Senator John McCain disagreed with Secretary Tillerson's priorities. In an op-ed in the New York Times, he reminded us that political prisoners take heart when they hear American leaders speak out in defense of human rights and political rights. We are a country with a conscience, he wrote. We have long believed moral concerns must be an essential part of our foreign policy, not a departure from it. We are the chief architect and defender of an international order governed by rules derived from our political and economic values. Secretary Tillerson has, in response, reiterated that our policies are adaptable, but our values do not change. So you see, these are not necessarily right versus left or Republican versus Democratic Party issues. For the Americans here today, in our national capital, this is about who we as Americans, as a country, and as a model of a functioning, albeit imperfect democracy, who we are. Our American experience has been for years an inspiration for others around the world, in part because we have fostered our shared values, what Senator McCain calls our strength and greatest treasure. The American students here today come from many different places, but all have chosen to be internationalists, to learn about and to care about what is happening beyond our ever more heavily fortified borders, to travel and meet people, learn to speak their languages, and to listen to them. For the foreign students and your families here today, let me say thank you for coming to school here, for putting up with visa fees and long lines at Dulles Airport. You have enriched the Elliott School by injecting your own questions and perspectives and knowledge of history and geography and culture into classroom debates, adding to the diversity of this university and this city. From you, we can learn not only more about your own countries, but also what is it that sets America apart and what our commonalities are. Let me conclude, not with a conclusion, but with a question to the graduates. What are you going to do about this historic moment? What are you going to do to make a difference? Everyone on this stage will tell you, you are graduating at an extraordinary time in our history. You may feel satisfied today with how far you've come, but we who are gathered here today look at you and rather impatiently ask, what next? Now, what are you going to do with it? With this potential that you have? My plea to you is don't be easily satisfied. Yes, spend today feeling good that you wrote those papers, passed those exams, completed those team projects and internships, impressed your professors, and made some friendships. Be justifiably proud of what you've accomplished and enjoy the sincere congratulations and admiration of the rest of us. But tomorrow, or the next day, or next week, or sometime this fall, I ask you to wake up and think about this question: how am I going to make a difference? Will you vote, volunteer, organize, write a letter to the editor, visit your member of Congress, circulate a petition, run for office, help a newly arrived refugee family? Will you stay abreast of current events and help explain them to others? Ask yourself, how am I going to make a difference at this unique point in our history? To make things just a little easier on you, let me take my challenge to you and apply it to a larger group. To the parents, siblings, extended family, mentors, and significant others of the graduates, to the faculty and staff of this great institution, the Elliott School, the George Washington University, in ways big and little, we must all decide what our values are and what we can do to foster these values in society. An important chapter in history is being written right now. Be a part of it. Thank you.